So I spent the day-to-day reading, or just finishing up rather, Heidegger's book, Introduction to Metaphysics, which was based on a lecture course that he gave at the University of Freiburg in 1935. And the book is called Introduction to Metaphysics. And it reads very, very smoothly and clearly. And for someone approaching Heidegger for the first time, it's a very good book to do, to serve as a good introduction to Heidegger, because it's more direct. And indeed, I found that to be the case of most of his lectures. They tend to be a little more direct than the essays and the books are. So for the first timer looking to play around with Heidegger, instead of just picking up Being and Time and trying to read that, start instead with the lecture course, History of the Concept of Time, for example, which goes through the basic ontology of the everydayness of Dasein. A lot of the basic ideas that are in Being in Time are in that lecture course, which was given in 1925, just a couple of years before he wrote Being in Time. And so this book is written after Being in Time, Intro to Metaphysics, and it exemplifies the so-called turn in which he becomes more interested in discussing being in terms of its different historical incarnations. Being is always incarnated in a different way in each society, whereas in Being in Time he had been interested more in a kind of synchronic structure of being, period. Now he has a sense and a sensitivity to the fact that each culture understands being in a very different way. And in this book he goes through and he looks at especially the history of the concept of being in the West. This book is also very good for understanding just what it is that he means by being, if you haven't read Being in Time, just what he means by being, because the way he uses the concept is very slippery. And at first, as he discusses in the opening of this book, it seems to be an empty concept. It seems to be, because it's such a vague general concept that seems at first glance to refer to everything. Everything that is, anything that can be predicated with the copula is something and has the quality of being, of existing. And so it appears at first glance to be an absolutely, a vapor, as he puts it in this book, an empty concept. But it turns out that it isn't that at all. This book makes that clear. And what he does is he starts by asking the question, he says, why are there entities rather than nothing? And he doesn't then proceed to go on to answer the question. It's not a question that he has the answer to, or that any philosopher has the answer to, really, other than in the Christian tradition, where we say that the reason there are entities is because they have been created by a maker. God has made them. But in this case, he poses the question, why are there entities rather than nothing, as the basic question of metaphysics. And he says, once we ask that question, we are moving into the realm of metaphysics, that which is above merely examining this particular entity or that particular entity. So why is there something rather than nothing? And then he immediately draws attention. He had just written an essay on what is metaphysics a couple of years prior to this, and in which he introduced a counter-concept to being, the nothing. That too is a slippery concept that is a little more clear here, where he says, when we look at the second part of that statement, why are there entities rather than nothing, then we begin to draw our attention to the possibility of non-being. In addition to being, there's the possibility that something might not exist, things might not be. And so he says that because entities are always held out into the possibility of their non-existence, then, this idea of the nothing introduces an oscillation into them, an unsteadiness. And so now when we begin to contemplate the nothing, we begin to see in a larger ontological sense that the nothing is what destabilizes entities and renders them possibly non-existent, or at least possibly not to be persist in the state in which they are at this present time. They could just as otherwise change properties, change states, or not exist at all. And so the nothing, the concept of the nothing, introduces this basic oscillation into entities, this basic instability. There's a certain wobbliness about being, about phenomena, entities in the world that he wants to draw your attention to here. And in the essay on what is metaphysics, where he said that basically, basically this idea of the nothing corresponds to, it's an ambiguity that he introduces into his ontology, that it corresponds to the function that we saw in the origin of the work of art that Earth played in a work of art which sets up a world and takes Earth and shines it forth radiantly, but Earth at the same time, in becoming conspicuous in a work of art, also has a self-secluding mystery to it. There are aspects in works of art that resist capture by meaning, that always evade the intellect's quest for meaning, as it were. And so as a result, there's always a basic ambiguity built into any great work of art. They can never be fully conquered by reason, by the mere intellect. And the same thing that loosely corresponds in his theory of truth as aletheia, as unconcealment to error. No system can be complete precisely because there is always error built into it, since things in the process of unconcealment are always simultaneously concealing facets of themselves and are constantly withdrawing away from it. Aspects of reality, of entities rather, are always withdrawing away from our grasp. And so no truth system can ever be complete. So there's ambiguity there as well. And the nothing corresponds, it functionally corresponds to these other concepts of the earth and error. It's this, Heidegger's very comfortable with ambiguity. He's very comfortable with realms where the intellect can't quite penetrate, can't quite get into. And I think it's very important to note that about him. Okay, so he starts out with this basic idea about why are there entities rather than nothing. He talks about the nothing, and then he moves on in the next chapter to a discussion of the etymology of being. So good. Then he starts to move into discussing being and what it is. And he starts to make very clear what he means by being when he gives a concrete example, and he's discussing a fragment from Heraclitus, where Heraclitus talks about strife as a basic conflict of elements that brings the world into being, that cleaves being into the realm of gods and men, and starts the process of everything rolling. And then Heidegger says it's the polemos, the polemical aspect, the strife aspect in Heraclitus's passage here that he wants to draw your attention to, because he says that this strife, this conflict, is what brings entities into being as entities. And so when he says what is an entity is an entity that appears in a world, in a specific world laden with meaning that makes that entity resonate and have significance. And what gives it significance is, of course, being, and being is always understood differently in each culture. And being, and he gives a number of examples of being in the text, where he says, for example, that Plato's idea of being is eidos, the forms. Heraclitus's idea of being is being as logos, a cosmic ordering, structuring principle that organizes, gathers, collects, holds things together, and organizes them. Or we've got Aristotle's conception of being as entelechy, which is a kind of immanent being. And then most important to him, of course, is the old pre-Socratic understanding of being as phusis, as entities coming into being, standing forth, manifesting their essences, and withdrawing. So that in the sense of being as phusis, which he says is the oldest understanding of being in the West, it's the pre-Socratic understanding of being. Entities show themselves of themselves. The autonomy is entirely put on them. The subject is not in the way here. They show themselves in themselves, and in doing that, they actually create space, he says in a later passage. They create their own space and their own world. And that's the original Greek understanding of being as phusis. So we see him using these different, giving these different concrete examples of being, so we can start to see what he means by being. It's that principle which in a culture or a philosophical system serves as a kind of ultimate concept that makes everything else intelligible within that system. That's all he means by being. And it has changed all the way down to the present day. And in this example, then, he says that poets, artists, and statesmen, through the strife, through the conflict that Heraclitus talks about, bring forth entities in this wrestle with being, and they make being manifest. Works of art are avatars of being. They're incarnations of being. They set being forth. Poetry is the capturing of being and setting it forth into language. A people enters history, as with the Greeks, through Homer. The Greeks entered into history and set up their Dasein, which is their sense of Greekness, their being there. And so we also have this, what is the difference between being and Dasein is an interesting question to ask, because Sein and Dasein are these two separate ideas. They're related, but they should be understood in the following way. Being means, it doesn't mean just something is there. When I say that, this glass is there, it has being. I can only say that because I've already presupposed an understanding of being that enables me to recognize the isness of this glass. So being is what prescribes meaning. It's the ultimate keystone that sets up an architecture of intelligibility in a society that makes everything else in that society comprehensible, and intelligible as such. Dasein, on the other hand, whereas being prescribes, Dasein does. Dasein is the particularly human mode of being in the world, and he says that in another book, The History of the Concept of Time, where he's describing the thing about Dasein, and that he doesn't want you to understand, is he says Dasein is being in the world, but by being in, he does not mean being in the sense of a spatial container. He doesn't want us to think that, you know, being in means being inside of something, although it does mean being in a world. But by being in a world, he means we're being in a world doing something because we're concerned with the tasks of our lives. And there's a basic, the basic average everydayness of Dasein is that we're always already engaged in tasks, we're involved in doing them. And so Dasein has, even though it's a noun, it should be understood as a verb, basically. We're always inging, we're always doing things, doing, approving, working, translating, prescribing. We're always inging. And that's what he means by Dasein. We're always already in a world building things, doing things. And there is a certain cognitive dimension to that, because you can't do any of your life tasks if you don't have a basic understanding of what it is that you're doing. And so there is knowing that's constitutively built into our basic Dasein. There's a certain pre-philosophical sense of it. Whereas the philosophical sense of significance has to do with Sein, with being. Being prescribes, it's almost like the genotype of a culture. Dasein is the phenotype, as it were. Being prescribes to the culture through poets, artists, and philosophers who listen to it, who have an ear for it, and then make it visible, set it up, and make it visible in a work of art. Whatever that particular understanding of being happens to be, they make it visible. And then others in the society, engaged in their life tasks, then carry it out through the daily living of their lives and their state of thrownness and their state of care and concern for everything that they are concerned with. So that's the difference between being and Dasein. And the essence of being then is that which makes things intelligible. It's a little bit like the way that Joseph Campbell and Carl Jung used to use the word myth, where they would use it as precisely the DNA of culture. Myth is what, through the telling of stories, enables a culture to come into being in the first place. And Heidegger has read Spengler, and you can sort of see the ghost of Spengler's thinking in this particular passage, because he talks about how over time the Greeks lost touch with being, and they lost it, and then in the decadent phases of a culture, entities no longer exist in a world laden with significance. Instead, they become mere objects, worldless objects, as is the case today. We are living in a society where we are completely divorced from being. We have no understanding of being anymore. There are no ultimate metaphysical principles guiding and shaping things so that when they appear, they're laden with significance for the culture. There's a certain nihilism and randomness in our society today, as there was for the Hellenistic Greeks after the period of Plato and Aristotle. And so a culture can lose contact with being in exactly the same sense in which Spengler says that over time cultures lose contact with the initial vision that crystallizes in the form of a specific religion that begins every culture and which makes sense out of that culture, and the culture carries it over time until they gradually start to lose contact with that initial motivating vision that set the culture going, building pyramids and cathedrals. And as the culture dies out, it loses touch with that initial mythic vision. Same thing here in Heidegger with being. A culture can lose touch with being. It can gradually fade out, and it can lose contact, and it can find itself in a mode as ours is today, and as the Greeks were in the Hellenistic Alexandrian phase of just building objects that are pointless, basically, and have no real world-building constitutive significance. And so this also invites a certain comparison, I think, with Jean Gebser, who in the Ever-Present Origin evolves a theory about these different successive structures of consciousness: the magical consciousness, the mythical consciousness, the mental consciousness, which Gebser says begins with the Greeks, the late phase of the mental consciousness structure, which is perspectival, 15th century for us, and then the integral, which comes all the way at the end. Gebser situates it in the 19th century. Basically, what Gebser is doing there is somewhat analogous to the way that Heidegger, after the turn in his work, begins to understand being as that shaping, metaphysical, ontological principle that makes things that appear within that epoch intelligible. Same thing with Gebser. The structure of consciousness makes everything appear in an intelligible way that makes sense within that field of consciousness. And so being is very much analogous